Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm going to be talking to you about assessments and outcomes in child sexual abuse and exploitation practice. My name is Dr. Jessica Eaton let's get into it. This is a really interesting topic. This is one of those topics where it could be really boring, if someone's, I don't really want to talk about measurements and outcomes and assessments and the science and the maths behind things like that. But and that would definitely have been me years ago. Those of you that have studied anything that needed like statistical packages or anything that required quantitative methods, I was one of those people that was like, do not give me anything with stats in, maths in, or any type of like factor analysis, because my head would just go bang. Until I met a guy, his name is Dr. Darren Bishop, and he is, and he knows that I describe him like this, like a total psychometrics nerd. Like, he knows everything. He's like a big encyclopedia that's sort of like, I met him, and at first his interest in the construction of assessments and scales and measurements, I didn't really understand why that was important or why that would be exciting or why that would be relevant to practice. I thought it was a bit of an academic exercise that we just sort of did, in research. And it wasn't until I spent time with him and then he was teaching these modules on advanced psychometrics that I started to realise how applicable this was to the work we were doing in child sexual abuse and exploitation, right? And at this point, when I started learning about this in about 2015, which isn't even that long ago, we're coming to the end of 2019 now, so, 4 or 5 years ago, when I went to learn with him and he helped supervise my own psychometrics that I was building, I'd already been working in sexual exploitation and abuse for a long time. And I knew that I had problems with the assessments, with the CSE toolkits, with the way that we were measuring outcomes, the way that we were assessing children. But I don't think I had the knowledge to explain why I had issues with it. I was the person that would just be like, yeah, I just think they're a bit shit. But I sort of felt like I knew why I felt like that, but I couldn't back myself up. And it was learning about test construction and assessments and measurement and factor analysis that made me think, that's what's wrong with them. That's why I don't like them. And it just gave me all this information and knowledge so that I could understand what was going wrong with these assessments. And so I wanted to do a podcast on this in, a really accessible way so that you don't have to take modules in psychometrics or advanced statistics or whatever, but so that you can sort of have a think about maybe if you're feeling uncomfortable about particular assessments, or there are factors or indicators on there that you think don't belong, or they're not really measuring what you think they're measuring. That I'm so interested in that now, and I'll blame that on Daz, because he just changed the way that I thought about them, and his enthusiasm for it, it just sort of rubbed off on me, and he just made me realise like how important this stuff was. But also, he's very critical of them, and he helped me to remain really critical of them. So sometimes you'll know yourselves, especially working in abuse and trauma, you'll be encouraged to use a psychometric, or you will have a colleague that uses a psychometric, or you will refer a child through that might be using a psychometric measure. So it might be like something for depression or anxiety, or maybe PTSD, or maybe it's an indicator checklist, or maybe it's SDQ. Like there's lots of different ways that we're using psychometrics and outcome measurements and assessments in our practice. But how much do you really know about the science of them? And can you really quantify depression? Is there really an assessment checklist for whether a child's being sexually exploited? Like, these are the questions that we need to ask. And from him, that was what I got, was like constant criticism about other people's psychometrics, about his own, about mine. And, I think having that around you is really important. And those of you that listen to me a lot or have seen me speak know that I really thrive off the critique of things, because I always think that, you know, we could be doing better. And when you get to a point where you think, oh yeah, that works, no need to change that then. And then you find you're still using the same resource or the same psychometric 25 years later, there's something wrong there. So I'm going to talk about it specifically in child sexual abuse and exploitation. I might pull some examples from elsewhere, but I'm going to start off talking about our assessments in CSA and CSE. And that's because for many of you, that will be where you are most familiar, and I'm then able to sort of pull in some of the science and the theory without going off on a tangent, basically. So, for those of you that don't know, I'm expecting most of you to know what these are. In child sexual abuse and exploitation practice in the UK, we use very heavily, we use child sexual exploitation indicator checklists, known as CSE indicator checklists, or a CSE toolkit, or a CSE risk toolkit. They have lots of different acronyms and names and things like that, but fundamentally they are actually the same thing. If, like me, because you're weird, I've collected all of them from around the UK. You just go on local safeguarding board websites, or you go on local authority resource type, websites or internet, and just download them all. What's really interesting is that almost every police force and local authority that's using a CSE assessment toolkit to try and predict the risk level of children, whether they're being sexually exploited or not, they all reckon they're unique, and they all sort of reckon that theirs is better, or theirs is the most up-to-date, or they've looked at it. But if you just download them all and look at them, they're all pretty much exactly the same. They overlap heavily. Some of them are word for word exactly the same thing. And they come from two main toolkits. They come from the Seraph, which was developed by Barnardo's Wales quite a long time ago now. And the way the Seraph was developed was it came from a larger piece of research that looked at cases of child sexual exploitation of girls, and using the factors, almost like the main, or let's call them symptoms for a second, but they're not true symptoms. So like the symptoms of what the children were displaying or exhibiting. Then they used factors that were coming from like the environment, or from the family, or from the school, or something like that. And from those cases, they built a list of indicators of what they thought would help practitioners to spot children who were being sexually exploited. That was the point of them. And so the intention of CSE toolkits was always good. It was always good. And the same with the NWG toolkit. It was the same thing was built for the same reason. It was, can we create a list of indicators of whether a child is being sexually exploited or not, so that practitioners can have a look at their list and think, oh, is the child I'm working with doing that? Or have they done that? Or has this happened to them? Or maybe that, or maybe this. Maybe it's CSE. And that's really as simple as it is, It wasn't anything, I guess, it wasn't really meant to be anything more than that. The problem came when they became really quite embedded into practice, where people took them on as like best practice. And now that was down to particular organisations and local authorities like literally holding them up as best practice and saying, do you know what, this is what you should be using, and everybody should be doing it, and everybody should be filling one in, and this is the way that we're gonna identify children who are at risk of being sexually exploited. And that, I think, is where we went wrong, because as you'll know, practice tends to just spread, especially in our field. So that means that before those assessments were ever tested, before those assessments were ever validated, before those assessments were checked scientifically, whether they were actually spotting children fast enough, or whether they were missing some groups of children, or whether they were accurately predicting risk in the way that they claimed to do. Before any of that happened, they had already been rolled out as best practice. which was easily one of our biggest mistakes. So that meant that police forces adopted them, schools adopted them, charities adopted them, children's social care adopted them, and then they sort of became like a universal tool that even like school nurses should be using, youth workers should use it, youth offenders should be using it, and that's why I think I was so shocked when I found out that they'd never actually been evaluated. And it's not that it shocked me that they'd never been evaluated, because I could tell just by looking at them that they'd never been evaluated. It was more how widespread their use was, but not just widespread. They were trusted assessments. CSE toolkits were trusted to do a good job, and they still are in loads of local authorities, charities, organisations, schools. They're still being trusted, despite the fact that, as I'm saying, there is actually no evidence that they work, and there's no evidence even for some of the indicators that are on those lists. So the advantages of something like this, if it was done correctly, which, as I'm going to talk to you about, it wasn't, and they're not built correctly, the advantages would be, hopefully you would miss less children, you would protect more children, and the biggest advantage, if it was to work correctly, would be that you would prevent children being exploited before it happened to them. So you would notice these indicators, and then you would think, oh my gosh, this child is at imminent risk of being abused by somebody, and we need to do something about it right now, and we need to intervene, right? That would be the point of them. Those of you that work with these assessments quite a lot will know that that's not how they work anymore. And most of those children that even score high enough to get a service are already actively being abused by somebody. And so the advantages are huge if they worked, but they don't work, which means we're left with a tool that is more than likely doing more harm than good, especially considering the evidence that I'll talk to you about in a moment about how many children these are actually missing and which children they're missing. So to go back to what I was saying, the first thing really is that what the toolkits did, and both the Seraph and the NWG toolkit did this, was it split indicators into low, medium and high risk. And it talked about those indicators, and practitioners talk about those indicators as if they're within the child. So they'll talk about the child and say, the child is high risk of CSE, the child is low risk of CSE, which is fundamentally incorrect, and it's stigmatising and it's insulting, because the child themselves does not hold any of the risk for the CSE. It's the sex offender that does that. So the child is not high risk of CSE unless there is a high-risk sex offender in their support network. It's impossible for a child to just walk around being high risk of being raped. There's got to be a rapist there. Do you know what I mean? And therefore, the argument right from the beginning could be you're assessing the wrong person. So by trying to use behaviours, characters, factors, environments, contexts to assess the child and then predict whether you think that child will go on to be raped or abused by someone, is sort of missing the point. Because by doing that, you're assessing the child and not the potential perpetrator. Lots of, don't get me wrong, lots of people who hear me say that will say, well, we don't know who the perpetrator is a lot of the time. And that's where I think this went very wrong. Because we feel like we can't affect change with perpetrators, especially when you don't know who they are, what happens is we over-focus on the child. So we assess the child to within an inch of their life. Who are they hanging around with? What school do they go to? Where do they walk? What time are they up till? Are they on the internet? Have they got social media profiles? Are they going out with their mates? Are they staying at people's houses? What are they wearing? Are they wearing loads of makeup? Have they got extensions in? Are they wearing a short skirt? Is their family in poverty? Is this? You've got all these factors. And the research by Brown et al. In 2016-2017 actually showed that the UK is currently using 110 individual risk indicators for CSE to essentially measure or predict whether that child is at low, medium or high risk of CSE. So 110 is a massive amount. Now, 110, not on every toolkit, that's actually how many indicators they counted across all the toolkits in the UK when they, took all the duplications out, because a lot of them are just duplications. Eventually, they found that there were 110 unique indicators that were being used or attempted to be used to predict whether the child was at risk of CSE or not. And again, that's without any evaluation or testing. So we actually don't know if any of those 110 indicators have any solid correlation or causal relationship with being sexually exploited or abused as a child, which is obviously really problematic. So the low, medium and high thing is also an issue because realistically, and I encourage you, if you're listening to this podcast and you've got an opportunity, go on your local authority's safeguarding board website. Like, you could probably do it right now if you're on your phone or on a laptop or an iPad, and go on Google and type in your local authority and then put CSE toolkit or put CSE risk or something like that. And it will very quickly give you the page that holds your local toolkit. And it will be a PDF usually or a Word document to download. And you'll be able to open it and have a look at what it is that I'm actually talking about. And they're usually a very basic matrix. They have indicators that might say something like low risk, change in appearance, and then it'll be a tick box. Sometimes on the toolkits they use red, amber, green, so they use RAG ratings. Sometimes they use numbers, so it'll be 1, 2, 3. Sometimes it's low, medium and high. Sometimes it's low, medium and significant. Sometimes it's low, medium, serious. And they're all, to be honest with you, that's like getting a bit bogged down in the detail because they all pretty much mean the same thing. As the funding and the resources got cut over the last sort of 5 or 6 years especially, what used to be that if the child came out as low risk from the assessment of that professional, they would get almost like, they would get some sort of support or an intervention, but it would be about just talking to that child, supporting them, giving them some awareness or education or something like that. Because linguistically what you're saying is that child is at low risk of being exploited. Therefore, if someone is at low risk of something happening, you don't think it's going to happen to them. Do you see what I mean? And actually, a lot of the language in CSE toolkits has been corrupted really badly. And now we talk about kids being low risk of CSE, and someone will say, oh yeah, they've already been groomed online, but they're still low risk. Like, well, they're not, are they? They're already a victim if they've been groomed online. We have to get back to like this proper plain language around this. If that child is being categorised as low risk of CSE, that means you don't think that they're going to be abused by anybody and that like they're at a low risk. And that's what it used to mean years ago. But as the funding levels got cut, children at that level of risk just didn't get any services at all, didn't get any support because there was no, sort of space for them. And what happened instead was that the child would have to hit medium risk or high risk to get some service either from a CSE team or from a charity or from a specialist intervention or service. And the indicators at medium were often already, if you were ticking any of those indicators in the medium level, that child was already being abused more than likely. I mean, some of the indicators in medium are anything from like children getting in cars of known sex offenders is a medium risk indicator, which makes no sense whatsoever. I would not have in a conversation with someone, forget about the toolkit for a second, if they said to you, the child has repeatedly been seen being picked up from school, and when the police ran the reg, it's a registered sex offender, it's someone that we know is involved in the exploitation and human trafficking, but I only think they're at like a medium risk really of being abused. You just look at them and be like, what? How did you come to that conclusion? Surely they're at high imminent risk if sex offenders keep picking them up from school. So that's another reason why these should have been tested and evaluated, because if we were to sit down and do a focus group and we were to look at the validity, So that's really important. When we're building stuff like this, we look at the validity of those indicators or factors. Are they valid? Are they in the right place? Are they measuring what we think they're going to measure? And I know that if we were to sit down and do a focus group and say, do we agree that children getting in the cars of known exploitation and human trafficking suspects, do we agree that that would make the child only medium risk of being raped or abused? Most professionals would say, no, I think that would be high. And that goes for a lot of the indicators on those CSE toolkits. There are so many indicators on those toolkits that if you just think about them for more than 4 seconds, you realise they're wrong. There are some in high risk of CSE. So the same thing with the language is that you're ticking and then you're categorising or recording that child is at high risk of CSE. So what you mean there, if we look at what those words mean in the English language, is that you think there's a high chance or a high probability, because risk has synonyms with probability, chance, potential, words like that, okay? So you're saying there is a high chance that the child might be sexually exploited. So that's what you'd mean by high risk CSE. Of course, those of you that work in it know that children who get high-risk CSE classification are children that are usually actively being exploited, trafficked, abused, or have already been exploited, trafficked, or abused, or are continuing to be harmed, abused, trafficked, exploited, raped, assaulted. So those children that sit at so-called high risk of CSE are actually victims of serious crime. A lot of them, they're victims of multiple serious crime. So therefore, they are not at risk anymore. They are already past risk. Because when we're talking about risk, we should be talking about future potential. Whenever you call a child at risk, you are specifically saying that child has not been harmed yet. You're saying they're at risk of being harmed. In the same way that if I stood on the edge of a cliff to take a photograph and someone said, that's a bit of a stupid place to take a photo, you're at risk really of falling off, aren't you? You know, that would be the correct use of that word. Jessica is at high risk of falling off the cliff taking a selfie. Right? You can't call me at risk when I'm at the bottom of the cliff or I'm falling down the cliff, because at that point, the risk has gone. I'm now in much, much more serious danger than before, and I am potentially extremely hurt or dead. You can't use risk in those situations. So, you know, you can probably get the gist of how problematic these toolkits are. And the question has to be asked, are we actually assessing the wrong person? Because these CSE toolkits, in the research, when Professor Sarah Brown and her team actually looked at these toolkits, not only from a sort of an analysis point of view, but also then qualitatively, and looked at them and interviewed practitioners and professionals and managers and researchers about the use of CSE toolkits. They found repeatedly that the toolkits were unreliable, they were not valid, they had not been evaluated, but also that they were missing groups of children. And that should have been enough in 2016 for us to withdraw all toolkits, because we knew through peer-reviewed scientific study, which is what we claim to rely on as evidence-based practitioners, that her team found and published that the toolkits did not identify boys properly. They did not identify any children, boys or girls, who were being abused online or exploited online. They were very unlikely to pick up groups of black children or children from other ethnic minorities. And that's because the toolkit indicators were based on white teenage girls, being sexually exploited by Pakistani Muslim men. It's a very stereotypical model. So that's, again, is one of those issues that would have been pulled up in evaluation. It would have been pulled up if these were put to the test before they were used on children. So if we decided to build a toolkit to try and identify a social issue, it would not make sense to build all of the indicators and the factors based on a stereotypical case. You would have to explore lots of different types of cases across a period of time and then look whether there were any general factors. Are there any general things that jump out over, let's say, a 10-year period of cases of boys and girls, online and offline, of all different backgrounds and ethnicities, but also age. The research found that it doesn't pick up younger children very well. But of course it wouldn't, because the indicators are based on teenagers. So, for example, things about going out, getting drunk, getting in cars, meeting new people, going on the internet and all that sort of stuff, that's not behaviour of a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old. And yet those children could still be being abused and exploited. It just won't come up on the toolkit. They'll always come out as low risk because the things you can tick are not for little children. A lot of the indicators are female-centric, which is fine if the tool was only for females, but it's not. It's for all children. So you have to make sure that the indicators are not sex or gender specific. You can't do that if you're building a toolkit that has to be accessible and works for everyone. So, for example, there are a number of indicators on toolkits that are about pregnancy or are about wearing makeup or about girls wearing short skirts or revealing clothing or over-sexualised dress. That, first of all, they're misogynistic. They're not true indicators of abuse. They're about misogyny. But second, a lot of them don't apply to boys. So the professional's never going to tick them for a boy, which means that the boy being abused can never get the same highest score as a girl could because the toolkit's biased. So, I mean, for me, that was enough. I think that should have been enough for us. We should have just scrapped them at that point, and that was like getting on for 3.5 years ago now, because there really isn't any excuse for using toolkits or assessments in any way that we know will miss groups of children, but we just carry on using them anyway. Now, I have been talking about this for maybe nearly 5 years, which is terrifying, actually. Just had a little bit of a crisis there. Lots of people over those 5 years have said, oh, you're so critical of this, why don't you just build a better one? You know? And honestly, I did think about it. And I didn't just think about it a little bit, I thought about it enough I have like a reflective diary that I've kept for years, and obviously it's not one diary anymore, it's lots of books, but in my reflective diary I write my ideas, and some of my ideas are toss and some of my ideas are great, and that's the same for everybody, but I always write them down, even if they turn out at the end and I think, oh god, that was an awful idea once you've like sketched it out, but it doesn't matter. It's about getting your ideas out of your head. And a lot of people would say to me, well, can't you just build one that works? If you know what's wrong with them and you know what we're missing, why don't you build the one that works, and then everyone can use it and we won't miss any of these children? And of course, the first thing you would think is, yeah, like I could do that, and then we could test it, and then we could have a solution to this problem. The more I sketched it out, the more I messed with it in my reflective diary, the more I looked at whether it would work or not, the more I realised that there were so many loopholes and so many gaps and so many flaws in how you would possibly measure whether a child might be exploited or not. I don't think it's possible. I honestly don't think it's possible. I think there are certain things you could measure for, but I don't think this is one of them. And it explains why there isn't anything in criminal psychology or in forensics or in sociology or criminology that exists like this. There isn't a predictive tool to figure out which kids are going to get raped and which kids aren't, because it's not one of those instances where it doesn't exist because nobody's thought about it. I think it doesn't exist because nobody thought it would be a good idea. And the more I think about it, the worse of an idea it becomes. So the first thing that I did was I looked at all of the research, and then I looked at how you could create a list of indicators that would actually be able to categorise which children might be exploited and which children might not. And the first thing that happened within a sort of few hours of me starting that exercise, was I realised that when you make a list like that, you're instantly going to miss children, aren't you? Because we know that anybody can be sexually abused. Anybody could be exploited. It could be the 16-year-old lad who fancies himself as a bit of a gangster and he's rock hard and he listens to grime and, he carries a little switchblade. And nobody's going to see him as a victim because everybody thinks he's streetwise and knows what he's doing and he smokes a joint, right? It could be he could be being raped every day, but he doesn't look like a victim. He doesn't act like a victim, right? In those stereotypes. So he's not going to get picked up anyway, even, and then you could be, or like, how do you build a toolkit that accounts for him and also accounts for a non-verbal 3-year-old who has, I don't know, developmental delay, who is being sexually exploited and their parents are selling them on the internet? How do you build a toolkit for that? How would you possibly create a list of characteristics that could predict which children those are going to happen to? You just can't. I don't believe it's possible. The more I built it and the more that I played with it and the more that I sketched it out and the more that I tried to do it, the worse it got. And I started to realise that we're doing this because we feel helpless. We feel like we need answers. We need to know which kids it's going to happen to, which kids it's not, so that we can put resources in, so that we can try to stop it, so we can protect them, so we can talk to them. But the reality is, we'd probably be better just blanket talking to all children, doing, protecting all children, and then putting all the responsibility back on adults, support networks, schools, youth clubs, venues, the adults in society. It's our job to protect kids. When you start using checklists like this, you instantly miss children. The other thing would be testing it. So say, for example, we did come up with a list of, I don't know, factors, indicators, whatever it is, right? You would then have to find a way of testing it. And realistically, especially in forensic psychology, if you're going to build something like this, you'd be looking at years and years and years of testing before you would actually use it in practice. And some of the assessments that are used in sex offending have been being reevaluated and critiqued and piloted and checked and rebuilt and then checked again for, 10, 15, 20 years. This is not an exact science. This is something, and also society changes. So you could build an assessment or a psychometric around a social behaviour like this, which is like abuse, and then in 10 years, the whole field has changed, and you would need to start again from scratch. An example of that is the way that sex offender assessments, rapist assessments, and sort of violent crime assessments didn't used to include the internet because the internet wasn't a thing. The internet didn't factor into crimes, and it wasn't being used as a way of exploiting, grooming, moving money around, stuff like that. Now it is. So we had to change. We had to change our assessments. We had to change the way that we worked. We had to start new pieces of research. We had to explore how criminals were using the internet and using electronic technology. So those things all had to change. So building something like this would be a very long process. It would need a lot of testing. But also, these CSE assessments that we use, they're used to make real life serious decisions about children. Do we place them in semi-secure? Do we place them in secure? Do we take them out of their school? Do we remove them from their families? Do we think they need an intervention? Do we think that they don't need that intervention anymore? Do we think that they need to be referred somewhere else? These are big life-changing decisions that we're using these CSE toolkits for, and we shouldn't be. And that was what, Brown et al. Said as well, was that these toolkits could be used potentially as like a learning aid, but nothing else. They shouldn't be used to be making decisions at all. And so, that is something that we really need to look at. Like, why have we ignored advice like that? So the other part of building assessments and measurements and things like that is outcome measurement. And what I mean by outcome measurement is in this specific sort of podcast is the way that we try to predict outcomes of children in a deficit model way of working. So I guess that brings us to talk about what it is that we're doing at the moment in practice, the way that we are trying to predict the outcomes of abused children, traumatized children. And one of the measurements that's sort of being celebrated and shared at the moment is ACEs, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences Score. And that is, for me, is a step backwards. It's not something I support, and it's the way that it's being marketed, and I think it's being marketed rather than just shared, is that it's a way of quantifying trauma and abuse so that we can make decisions about resources and services and stuff like that. Now, I have spoken to lots of different people at different levels of I guess, authorities and government, and there is definitely pressure to use ACEs to be able to refuse service, for sure. Like I've had that exact conversation with at least 2 local authorities where they're saying, well, if the child or the adult doesn't have an ACEs score of over, if they have an ACEs score over 5, then they'll get a service. Under 5, they won't, because that's how we're going to do it from now on, okay? And there are serious problems with with ACEs, and it's not just me saying this. There's quite a lot of academics and practitioners that recognise that there is a true issue with ACEs and the way it's being used. Now, it is really important, and I encourage you to do this when you get off from listening to this podcast, is research the origins of ACE, of adverse childhood experiences, because it's not what you think it is. It wasn't tested to do what it is that we're doing with it right now. Adverse childhood experiences, if you've not done it before, I would also encourage you to do your own ACEs score as a professional. I'll warn you, obviously it asks you questions about whether you've been abused or whether you witnessed violence when you were growing up and things like that. But I think it's very enlightening, and I feel as though when you actually read the ACEs research and some of the things that people are saying about people with high ACEs scores, and these predictions, these outcomes, I think professionals should be made to do it as well, because it's really scary that I could be talking to a professional that sort of says, oh yes, I'm working with this child who their ACEs, they've got a lot of adverse childhood experiences, their ACEs score's like 9, their outcomes are going to be really affected, they're less likely to do this, they're less likely to do well at school, less likely to get a career, more likely to end up in prison, more likely to end up on drugs, more likely to do this, less likely to do that. And actually we know, don't we, that a lot of us in this field are here for a reason. We're here because of ACEs. Loads of us are. Loads of us are in this field because we were in care, or because we were abused, or because our families were, chaotic or terrifying to live in, because we didn't even finish school, or because we lived in poverty, or we experienced, subjected to oppression and discrimination. And that's how you end up in these types of social roles, whether that's psychology or counselling or social work or youth work. You're there because you want to make a difference. A lot of people are in this field for a reason. And that means that whenever I've done this with a group of professionals at a conference or in a training room, their ACEs scores are usually anywhere between about 7 and 9. But based on the statistics, nobody in that room should be there because we should all be like, really struggling, not being able to cope with life, not being able to make good decisions. We'll all have cognitive distortions and, developmental issues and all the rest of it, right? We've got to start looking at what a deficit model does when it's trying to quantify. So ACEs is not a strength-based tool. It's a deficit-based tool. So what it does is it wants you to add up all of the horrible things that were done to that child and then predict their outcomes based on that number. Now, if we go back to some of the really sort of more, I guess, scientific arguments around this, the first thing you would do if you were building a true like ACEs score is that you would have to include any and every traumatic experience possible that could happen to a child. Otherwise, this wouldn't work, would it? So if you were going to create a score of how traumatised a human was, you would have to come up with literally every single thing that you could possibly think of. And yet the ACEs questionnaire only covers 10 things, and 2 of them are the same. So it only covers 9 things. So it covers things like domestic violence, sexual abuse, whether your parents were in prison, whether your parents were an alcoholic or a drug addict, whether I think loss might be in there, and you'll know yourselves from the work you do and from your own lives that's missing quite a lot of things that can happen during childhood. Just off the top of my head, like it misses things like bullying, FGM, forced marriage, witnessing something else, a natural disaster, oppression, of any kind, racism, like there's so many different things that, like, I don't know, your house burning down. There's so many things that would be I would consider a childhood trauma that aren't in the ACEs questionnaire. So these children are getting scores based on these things, and then we're then predicting outcomes, and we've even got authorities making decisions based on these scores, and yet they don't include like loads of things. So they can't possibly be valid, can they? The way it's being used internationally really worries me too. So, for example, an ACEs score in some countries can be used against you, so you can't get home insurance, or so you can't get insurance on, your mortgage. It can also be used against you on your life insurance. So if your ACEs score is really high and you had a lot of childhood trauma, because they correlate a high ACEs score with suicide and self-harm and other types of what they call a mental disorder. Obviously, I don't subscribe to that, but what they call it, they're then allowed to refuse your life insurance or increase the premiums because you're seen as higher risk. And that, to me, is discrimination. You can't, you shouldn't be allowed to discriminate based on what happened to a kid like that. But as all insurance works, it's based on evidence and research and the proportion or the probability of or the statistics that support this, this and this. So, like when you go for your life insurance and it asks you how much you weigh, that's because there is published peer-reviewed research that suggests that if you weigh this, then this is your probability of dying of heart disease, this is your probability of dying of cancer, this is your probability of having a stroke, right? And that's exactly what they're doing, but they're doing it with ACEs. Now, that really worries me. That's already happening in some countries, not in the UK at the moment, but it won't take long. So that can be misused. However, I do have an example before I go, of how it was misused in the UK. And I was made aware, and this was pulled, so this is no longer happening, that it was being used on pregnant mums. So when women were going for their 12-week scan, they were being given an ACEs questionnaire, and then they were being their ACEs score was then being passed through to children's social care to decide whether they wanted to do a pre-birth assessment on that mum about the safety of or the capabilities of her parenting. That is not okay. That's something we can never allow to happen. That's not strength-based. That's not trauma-informed. That's oppressive, and it's discrimination. So this is just this is just such an interesting topic. I could go on forever, but I need to stop now. I really strongly advise you that if you're working in assessments and this type, assessments outcome measurement, learn about the science behind them, learn about factor analysis, learn about how they're built, learn about evaluation of them, learn about psychometrics, because it will just make you so much more robust when you need to argue that you don't agree with an assessment or you don't believe the factors or the indicators are correct. And if you would like to talk to me about this podcast, you're absolutely welcome to email. But other than that, thank you for listening, and I will catch you on another podcast.